Hello, everyone. Raven here, and today I'm going to do something very difficult. I just finished playing through the whole story of Tears of the Kingdom. I have not finished 100% of the game, but I have finished, I'd say, over 50% of pretty much everything. And after watching the end of the game, I had to come on and share. So this is going to be in two parts because I know it's probably going to take a while. This first part, I'm just going to try to be constructive, and I'm going to just stay away from spoilers. Just barely scratch the surface about the story. That will mostly be in the next video. This one, I want to talk about just comparing to Breath of the Wild for the most part. First, let's start with the controls and just how combat works. Of course, very similar, close to the same. However, few changes here and there. And I have one complaint. One big complaint. Now, it's my preference partly, but I also think it's one that most people would agree could be better. And that is their change with the arrows. Now you do not get a choice of your standard arrow, your fire arrow, lightning arrow, snow arrow, etc. You're stuck with just arrows, but you can attach different things to it to have different effects. Which, kind of nice at first, but there's a big issue to me. You could say it's kind of sad because you don't get as much ammo, which I don't know, that's not a big deal. But for me, it's the way every single shot you have to choose. You have a long list of all these items you can choose from. And as you go and you choose one, you shoot the arrow with that item. The problem is, after that, you're using a standard arrow again, and if you want to use the same thing you just used, you have to go back into the list and pick it again. And again. And again. And again. It's much more time consuming. Gets in the way of the flow of the battle in some ways. It just gets annoying. But mostly that's me. I'm sure there's some who would be disappointed with that, the way I was, but if they had added that feature where you could just choose to use that until you go back to the standard arrow, that would have been so much better. Other than that, fantastic. There's one thing that's a little bit... It's not with the controls, it probably depends on the player. But one thing that can be a little bit annoying, pretty much got the same thing you have in Breath of the Wild. It works great. Way you fire arrows when you're in the air, the way you move around, the way you target, pretty much the same. There's no real difference. One thing you don't have, this is not huge, but was also a nice feature in Breath of the Wild. Because your abilities are different now, you don't have the bombs you had in Breath of the Wild. The reason I bring that up, the one thing that was great about those was you always had them. They may not have been extremely effective as a weapon, but if all of your weapons got worn out, you lost everything, you still had that as a sort of backup. Very minor thing, but that's one thing that's kind of sad. There's not much to go with if you run out of ammo and your swords get damaged to the point they're gone. But, other side of the coin, one thing that is nice that I noticed in this, I think it's multiple things they did, but even though I'm sad they didn't change the way the damage on the weapons worked, one thing they did do that was nice is I've noticed a lot more availability. It's a lot easier to get a decent weapon. Before, it was, you just had to pick up a stick or something, and it was useless. In this, not so much. They're all over the place, and you can get them pretty quick. part of the reason I think this is because I've noticed a lot of the weapons, at least the ones I've seen so far, there are some that level up as you get more hearts, so I know they can go higher than what I've got for those weapons. But for the most part, I've noticed the stats are lower in this than they were in Breath of the Wild. At first, that would sound like a bad thing, but the nice thing about that is the ones that the enemies use, same thing. So it's not like it really makes a huge difference as far as the difficulty. It makes a little bit, but not as big as you might think. But the nice thing about it is it makes it so that the slightly weaker weapons, it's not as huge of a difference in some cases. Of course, you get something like the stick that's just a couple points, then yeah, that'll make a huge difference. But at the same time, every point up makes a bigger difference than it would have before. So yeah, combat's got its little things, little quirks, but also a few things that make it a little bit better. Pushing forward, let's get to the graphics and the design. Wonderful. It's, again, very much like Breath of the Wild, but boy, is it impressive with the massive, enormous size of this, that it still works as well as it did. I had only one time in this first playthrough where it actually had that freeze up it had in Breath of the Wild when you went too far. Only once. Because I was diving so fast, so far, into one of the holes to go underground. That's what it took before it froze on me. And it was only for a second. So, wow. Wow, did they do well with that. As for the design, holy crap. They had a great way of doing this where you felt like you were kind of in the same world as you were before, but not the same map. It was all laid out the same, but boy, they changed it. I was concerned. Not the way most people are thinking, no real difference. My concern was that in too many places, it would only be a change of debris. Because I noticed in trailers and places, that's what you saw mostly. As far as the difference, was just debris from what went up into the sky. And I was worried they were going to kind of use that as an excuse of, here, see? Here it's different. When they didn't really change the map much. Oh, they changed a lot. All of it? No. Because like I said, still got the same basic layout. But boy, there's so many places in this where you go and you just don't recognize it. The other thing that's happened with the design that's really interesting is it's easier to get places. It's not as time consuming, not as difficult. But it's weird. Because the problem before was just trying to climb and get up places. Now you still have to do that a bit. It's just not as much. And because of that one feature of ascending, going through the ceiling, that changes everything. However, one thing that I can't say was bad, but drove me nuts, and still is driving me nuts, is underground. The dark areas underground are really frustrating for me. Lighting it up, you've got to use ammo, which means you kind of got to be careful. You got to make sure you're not using it too often in the wrong place, otherwise you might get stuck where you don't have it. It can get so annoying trying to find your way around in this. You can end up going in circles without even realizing it. But that's it. That's the only complaint as far as the design of the map goes. One thing I can see some people complaining about, doesn't bother me much, but I know a few people might not be as pleased, is the Sky Islands. There's a lot of them, but not that much in comparison to the size of the map. You've got a massive amount of land to cover underground, but up in the sky, not as much. Which, like I said, I don't mind. I think it's good. I think how much they have is great because it's there, but I can see a lot of people being disappointed because this whole thing focused on that. Everything in their publicity focused on that. They hardly even mentioned or showed anything of what's underground, and yet that's huge. And to be honest, there's not a whole lot down there. You've got a couple plot lines that go on down there, and one that is one of the temples that is amazing. The design of that was magnificent. But the majority of it, there's not a whole lot to it. It's a little too repetitious, almost. One thing that is down under the surface, though, that is kind of neat, is some of the major bosses are there in certain places, so you can battle them more than once, which is fun. I'll say, that's one thing that's great about the design. That's one of the best parts of the design of this whole game. The bosses are fantastic. There's one that I personally wasn't as crazy about, but that was simply because of something else, so I'll touch on it in a second. But for the most part, they were great. And the final boss was magnificent. I loved how they did that. But the one that was an issue, without giving any spoilers, there's a contraption you take control of. Luckily, you don't always have to. You do, however, for this fight. This contraption, I personally did not like the controls. They weren't bad, it's just the layout of it, it was a little awkward to me, and it practically altered the main layout of the controls in the game. So it just got really annoying. Other people might not mind it as much, but for me it was really, really annoying. So the design, fabulous with those few things that were a little annoying. But overall, wonderfully done. Next. Sound and music. Wonderful. Just like Breath of the Wild. I personally was a little concerned. This is a very personal thing. Very much a matter of preference. But unlike a lot of people, I did not enjoy the music that was in the trailer as much. A lot of people went nuts about it. I personally, the sax just felt out of place to me. It just didn't fit right, in my opinion. But in the game, you didn't get as much of that. That was hardly there at all. And what was there was great and had the great themes from Breath of the Wild, with a few also having some different mixes. So it wasn't like they took it out and replaced it, or they changed it. They did both. They gave you the original tracks in places, but then they also gave you altered versions of it in other places. It was wonderful how they gave you everything. A little bit of everything. Kind of the way the whole game is. Lastly, the story. Wow. As I said, I'll do another video where I'll really go into it. But to sum it up, let me just say this. to, if I'm going to come at it with that constructive criticism, say, really good story, really neat story, but could have been a little better. If they had been willing to take a little more of a risk, in a sense, take some chances. There was a way I would have written this, a way I would have taken it, that I think could have been so much better, in a way they even could have used. I don't necessarily think they should have done it and used it, but they could have taken this route and had a neat tool for DLC. I wouldn't necessarily want that. I would have been fine with it. But I just find it kind of disappointing they went where they did because of that. However, what I will talk about in the next video is why, deep down, I'm so glad they didn't do that. Because it struck a very personal chord. So I have to say, to me, good story, good development. Unlike with Breath of the Wild, you really feel like you're part of the story. You really feel like you're in it and you're playing it out. You're not just going and watching flashbacks and nothing else. You're actually part of this story. You're not viewing it all from hindsight. So, big step up on that. They did an excellent job with it. And one thing they did, kind of twist from what you normally see in Zelda games that was interesting. In the past, the way Zelda games were always set up was you'd have a few temples or a couple dungeons that you'd beat, and then you'd go to face Ganondorf or maybe another boss. But you go to face them, and then you'd find out there's more to this than you knew. And then you have to go on to face the real temples that are like 4 or 5, maybe even 6. What was interesting about this one is it kind of did the opposite. It started off with several. Then you found out there was more, but it wasn't much. It was like the majority of the game came first, then the latter part was shorter. Whereas usually it was the short part that was first, then the bigger part was later. So that was interesting. And I think worked well, because in this case, if they had tried to go and make the latter part long, that would have been too long. I would have enjoyed it. I would have liked it. But it wouldn't have worked as well. So yeah, I have to say, excellent. Excellent game. Very well done. If I had to rate it from that more constructive side, I'd give it somewhere, I'd say maybe around a 9.2 out of 10. Just because of those little things that I think could have been better. There's a few parts that were just annoying, frustrating. Just because of those, yeah, I can't put it at a full 10. But it's still fantastically done. So if you want to really get into the story, do my next video. It's going to be spoilers. I'll see you then. God bless.